Okay, let's begin. So the Gemara that we've been learning, we're on Daf Yud Tes Amud Beis. We turned the page yesterday and got up to the Mishnah. Well, so we're up to Yud Tes Amud Beis 19b, and the Gemara that we learned was basically the four interpretations of what is Psal Hayotze Min HaSukkah, this special law that seems to be like a maybe a halacha l'meishem Sinai. It seems to be some type of chidush that that this is permissible. It's that Psal Hayotze Min HaSukkah. You would think it's not kosher, and it's considered kosher. And each of the cases was very really, each of them were somewhat complicated because they all seem to be questionable. Do they work or don't they work? Shouldn't they work? Should they? Does it make sense that they work? And so we went through the different cases, and we've seen there seems to be an argument, Rashi and Tosfos, at least on the first case we had a machlokes. Rashi learns that it has to do with the walls, the middle wall. Tosfos learned had to do with the schach. The schach wasn't put on for the right purpose. And then we had the second answer is talking about the front of we're dealing with the entrance of the sukkah, and the entrance of the sukkah doesn't have threefold. It doesn't have a sheer sukkah, or it doesn't have the second second side wall going along it, and yet it's still going to be kosher as long as you have one wall going along it. And then we had the psal hayotze min HaSukkah means that you have an area in your sukkah that's not properly thickened with schach. It doesn't have a thick schach. It has a very thin layer of schach. So it's chamsa meruba mitzilas. It's an area in your sukkah that has more sunlight than shade, and because of that, there's room to think that maybe that area maybe you couldn't sit under or sleep under, and according to other opinions, maybe the whole sukkah could be invalidated from it. And the answer is no. We look at the whole sukkah. So the psal hayotze min HaSukkah isn't a problem. You could even sleep under it. And then we even had Reb Ishaya, which had this insight that even the schach pasol on a small sukkah, that you would be able to use invalid schach to validate your sukkah. And even more than that, according to the Reb Hoshaya asked a question to Reb Oishaya. There's Oishia. Maybe better we should say Reb Oishia and Reb Hoshaya. Maybe that's a good way to hear the difference in the names, because the two names sound very similar. So we'll pronounce Reb Oishia. I think that's the way my Rebbeim pronounced Reb Oishia. Reb Oishia and Reb Hoshaya. So Reb Oishia has this insight that when you have non-kosher schach, it can actually help your sukkah become kosher. If your sukkah was missing a little of the minimum size, the non-kosher schach can validate your sukkah. It actually helps to make the size a kosher size. If it's less than 3 handbreadths, but it makes it'll help. It'll be an add-on that'll kosher your sukkah. And Reb Hoshaya asks that what that's not so impressive, because even empty space would help out your sukkah. And the way Rashi learned is the answer of the Gemara. Reb Abba says, yeah, but there's a big difference. Empty space you can't sleep under, you can't eat under, even less than 3 handbreadths. But schach that's invalid, that you would be allowed to even eat under and sleep under. So once you have that answer, so it seems that maybe that's what the schach, that what the Brisa is saying that psal hayotzim in sukkah nidon kesukkah, that this area that's puzzle, again, he's using the word psal, meaning the puzzle schach, that's yotzei min sukkah, it's going out of the regular rules of a sukkah, it's going to be judged like a sukkah, that not only does it make it the right size, that's not such an impressive thing, but it's judged like a sukkah that you could even sleep under. So in other words, it sort of changes the understanding. Initially, we thought it meant that the insight was that you're able to use that measurement to kosher your sukkah. The Gemara's answer is that's not such a chiddush, because Reb Hoshaya asks, he says that's not so impressive. We know that from the even empty space could do that. So the answer that Rababa gives, no, but you could even sleep under it. So now we could take that answer and put it back in the meaning of the brisa, that psal hayotzim min sukkah, this invalid schach that goes that's in this area of this small sukkah. You have a little area of invalid schach that is actually judged like a sukkah, and you could even eat and sleep under it. So this is Rashi's way of learning the Gemara. Yes, David.
This says this is a Tosefta. So what's the difference between a Tosefta and a Brisa?
Oh, it pretty much is the same thing. A Tosefta was sort of like different rabbis. They sort of edited. They had a little more edited format. So the Tosefta is, but it's still not a Mishnah. It's just it's basically a collection of statements from the Tanoic rabbis, which is what brises are, and the Tosefta is the way Reb Chia put it together in his Tosefta. So maybe you could say it's slightly more edited, maybe than the regular raw brisa, but it's pretty much the same. Yeah. Okay, so that's the way Rashi learned. Now Tosfos comes up with a complicated, maybe I shouldn't use the word complicated, with a different interpretation. And I use the word complicated because it really knocks a lot of the way it changes a lot of the way we understood the rules of kosher schach and non-kosher schach, empty space versus empty space versus in non-kosher schach. Tosfos has a few questions on Rashi, and he wants to say that, and this is going to surprise you a little. He wants to say that what's the difference between sleeping under empty space and sleeping under invalid schach? So we said Rashi's shot, which to us made a lot of sense, that invalid schach is not as bad as empty space. Empty space, you can't sleep under or sit under, even if it's less than 3 handbreadths. In non-kosher schach, you're allowed to sit under and sleep under. And we even have a source for such a thing. If you remember the Mishnah earlier on, it talked about where you have the spits, or you have the bedposts that are used as schach, and you're going to sit under, you're going to remove every other one, and you're basically sitting under the non-kosher schach, and it's considered okay. You're allowed to. We have a source. We seem to have a source for such a thing, and it makes sense, right? You're sitting under non-kosher schach. It's sort of like it's less than 3 handbreadths. It's nullified to the sukkah. It's kosher. It's okay. Tosfos comes and flips a little of the way we are thinking, but he doesn't flip it completely. He says when it comes to a small sukkah, the law actually is a little different than we thought. When it comes to a small, tiny sukkah, what happens? If you are using non-kosher schach to validate your sukkah, Tosfos says, guess what? You can't eat or sleep under that non-kosher schach. But if it was empty space, then you have the law of Lavud. And the law of Lavud says we fill in the empty space. So imagine you have a 5-hand breadth sukkah and you have empty space. Taisa says there you are allowed to sleep and to eat under the empty space. Because Lavud, it's considered like it closes up. What about Pasol Schach? He says, Pasol Schach, it's a small sukkah. Nope, that you can't do. That you can't sit under. It's invalid. It's invalid schach. You don't have the law of Lavud. You don't have this special law that Lavud says it's attached. We don't have a special law like that by schach, if you have invalid schach. So when you have empty space, you have a law of Lavud, and therefore you could sleep under it. When you have non-kosher schach, how are you allowed to sit under it? It's non-kosher schach. You don't have the law of Lavud. So when it's a big sukkah, he says is different. A big sukkah is a whole different story. But here, the sukkah here, it's a tiny sukkah, and you're not going to be allowed to sit under the non-kosher schach. And according to the way he learns it, you actually answer the way the Gemara the answer of the Gemara is flipped around. The Gemara's answer was this one you could it joins together, and you can what was the words? This one joins together, and it joins together, and you could sleep under it. And this one joins together, and you can't sleep under it. That was the answer. But which one is which? So Rashi learned to us, which sounded much more logical. This one you could it joins together, and you could sleep under it. It's the non-kosher schach. This one joins together. You can't sleep under it. Is the empty space? When it's empty space, you can't sleep under it. The logic behind Rashi, it has to do with the fact that when there's empty space, it's so visible, it sticks out, and that's why you can't sleep under it. Non-kosher schach, it becomes nullified. It's more nullified. So Rashi's pshat is that the one that says this one you could joins together and you can sleep under it, that's the non-kosher schach. This one joins together, you can't sleep under it, that's when it's empty space. Taisa says, no, you got to read it the opposite way. This one, it joins together and it's you can sleep under it. That's the empty space because you have the law of Lavud. Lavud says you join together whatever is next to each other within 3 handbreadths. You can join it together. You have kosher schach right next on the right side. You have kosher schach on the left side. Less than 3 handbreadths of empty space in the middle. Join it together, and so that you can sleep under it. Join together, sleep under it. When it comes to puzzle invalid schach, that doesn't have the law of Lavud. So what are you going to join? What are you, you're not able to join the right side and the left side of kosher schach together. So according to that, you're basically stuck. You basically can't sleep under it. The sukkah is kosher, but you're not allowed to sleep under that area. Now, according to him, the way you read the brisa that says Sol hayotzim min sukkah nidoin kesukkah, which David just corrected me. That's really, I should use the word Tosefta. Thank you, David. So how does he read the Tosefta? Sol hayotzim min sukkah nidoin kesukkah. So the way he would read it is that the pasol schach that's yoytze min sukkah, that is going out from the rules of the permit of a sukkah, the rules of a sukkah that this is non-kosher schach. It's not part of the rules of sukkah. Non-kosher schach is nidain kesukkah. It's judged like a sukkah, even a small sukkah, and you could even join it together, even though you're not going to be allowed to sleep under it. So now, you might think that because you can't sleep under it, you also can't join it. They can't be joined together. So the answer is no. that even though you can't sleep under it, it's still nidoin k'sukkah, still judged like a sukkah. So Rashi learned that we're telling you the insight that you're allowed to sleep under. Tues is learning that even though you can't sleep under it, it's judged like a sukkah, that it could be joined together. It could join it together. It's a little complicated the way Tues is learning, because our whole way of understanding the previous Gemaras, this seems to contradict it. And the way Tues is explaining it, it has the reason for the change is because this is a small sukkah that somehow changes the rules around. But I think the in addition to that, I'm not sure if Tosfos is accepted in Shulchan Aruch. I think Rashi's shot might be the one that's accepted in Shulchan Aruch. I'm going to pull up here. I have in the back over here a halacha. Let me just pull it up here. Where you have schach pasol va'avir. So he says schach pasol less than 4 tfachim does not pasol in a large sukkah, and you could sleep under it. Schach pasol less than 3 handbreadths joins a small sukkah together, and you're allowed to sleep under it. So that is Rashi's opinion, and that's the psak in Shulchan Aruch. It's something small, and it's as if it's not there. And there are other chumras from the Chayei Adam says maybe you should be machmir like these other shitas, which he says is the Raiva, the Ritva, the Riyaz, that maybe you shouldn't sleep under it. And he says even a big sukkah only if it's less than 3 handbreadths. So those seem to be that's a different opinion, it seems. I don't know if that's connected to this Gemara specifically, but the point is that the Shulchan Aruch paskins like Rashi, and you're allowed to sleep under, even in a small sukkah, less than 3 handbreadths of non-kosher schach, but if it's empty space, then you would not be allowed to sleep under it. And of course, that has to do with how much. It either has to go along the whole sukkah from the end wall, the middle wall, all the way to the front, or there's a measure of your head or your majority of your body that is right under the empty space. But if you don't have that measurement, then the empty space doesn't mean anything. It's no problem. It's not an issue at all. Yes, Jeffrey.
So Tosfos also makes use of that idea of the mud, that you can count it.
That's the next Tosfos, different Tosfos. I didn't even review that Gemara yet. In a minute, if you'd like, I'll give you the honor of telling us Tosfos, and once I say the Gemara. So the next Gemara is the next little piece is that the Gemara asks a question on the bottom of 19a. The Gemara says, is it possible to have such a thing, that it could join together and it itself, you can't dwell under it, you can't sleep under it? How could you have such a thing? Now, the way Rashi learned this is that how could you have empty space that it'll join together and you're not allowed to sleep under it? And the Gemara answers, we have a similar thing. We do find a similar thing. So where do you find that? So he says that tit haneroik or hanaroik, tit hanaroik is this horrible mud that on the one hand, it joins a mikvah that's missing some water, rainwater. Let's say you have a little less than 40 saw, and you want to join this horrible mud to the mikvah. That would kosher your mikvah and make it the proper size. It would be considered usable to add to the mikvah, to count into your 40 saw, which is the measure a mikvah needs to be. However, nevertheless, if a person has a mikvah that big, a person has a mikvah that's filled with the tit hanaroik, would you be allowed to toivel in that? No, you can't toivel in that mikvah. And
it's basically sewage. You're talking
No.
about toiveling in a sewer, really. That's what
No.
you're talking
Well,
about.
this is the
Horrible
thing.
water.
There's a difference between smelly water, which Tysus does bring down. That's another discussion. And there's titanoroik, which is mud.
Disgusting.
It's more disgusting, but it's not fully discussed because every lake has some mud on the bottom that gets muddy. You know, when you kick there's mud. I mean, that's part of
They're
swimming.
not talking about
Not in
mud here.
a
They're
swimming
not
pool.
talking
Yeah.
about cloudy water because it was sand or mud or whatever. They're talking
No,
here.
no. It is.
No.
It's mud that's thick. If it's thick, it's a problem to be toivel in it. Not because of dirt, not because it's disgusting, because of the thickness of it. It can't be counted as part of a mikvah. But if it's thin, then it's kosher. Now, what you're talking about and what you're saying is not wrong. It's referring to what you're referring to is brought in other places. And Tysus brings it down that there is a concept of smelly water. If you look in the end of Tysus, he talks about it's masriach. It's not chazi l'shtias behema, but here we're talking about mud. And the issue is it too thick to be kosher for a mikvah? Not. And the answer, and the thing is, if it's naroik, if it's horrible mud, then it would be kosher to add to a mikvah. But it's not gonna be, if you want to be toivel in a mikvah made of 40 saw of this mud, that would not work. So what Rashi, the way Rashi is learning it, is something along the lines of, you see that something could help join the measurement, the minimum required measurement, but at the same time, that itself item is not really kosher for toiveling it. Now, the problem with Rashi is what happens when you use that titanaroik, you use that pourable mud in a mikvah that has a lot of kosher water, rainwater, and would you be allowed to dunk in the area of the titanaroik? Would you be allowed to dunk in that area that has the titanaroik? So if you could, then Rashi's way of learning the Gemara is not so smooth, because the Gemara was bothered with, you're using empty space of a sukkah and telling me it's kosher to, it makes the size of the sukkah proper, but you can't dwell under that empty space. Let's compare that to the mikvah. The mikvah, you could use pourable mud to help make the minimum size of a mikvah. But guess what? You're allowed to dunk in that pourable mud if it's mixed with kosher water. It's just a mikvah that's completely mud, that you can't be toivel in. But if it's just mixed with other water to help out the size, then you could actually be toivel in the mud part of the mikvah. So what comes out, if you learn that that's the meaning of this, if you clarify that that's actually the halacha, then the Gemara's flow doesn't really work so well, because it's not the same as a sukkah. A sukkah, you have an actual contradiction, like a real paradox, an oxymoron, where you're using it for the measurement of a sukkah, but in that same area you can't say no. By the mikvah, no, you could actually dunk in that. It's when you have a whole mikvah that's made of pourable mud, you can't dunk in. But if there's a kosher, the majority kosher water and a little non-kosher, then you can't. So it's not a good comparison. Yes, Mordechai.
Yeah, in the Mishnayos that are recited before the last Kaddish the Rabbanon, it talks about this loose mud. It says that because a person or something that's being immersed in it, that since they first go through the water, before hitting the mud,
right,
they're
correct.
Right. So So anyway, Tysus has another. Did you want to say Tysus, Jeffrey? Did you want to tell us what Tysus says over here?
Well, I think it comes to different.
I didn't. Okay. Someone. One second, Jeffrey. I just muted everyone, so you have to unmute if you want to. Forget it. Okay. So Tysus over here.
Yeah, Tosfos seems to come to a different conclusion, though.
And what's his conclusion?
That that the space you can't lie down or eat under the space. But if you have not too much parcel schach in one place, you would be able to eat anywhere in that sukkah. But he's using the same analogy that you go through the water first, basically, and then you come to the snarok, whatever it is. I think other places have newer translations for it. But yeah, you have to understand the scene, because a lot of the times when people went to mikveh, let's say in Europe, the mikveh house was built on the river or near caves. Like in Israel, they have caves or grottos. And let's say the water is low tide. So you have water that makes 40 saw in one space together with whatever's underlying it. And then later in the day, there might be more water coming in. But at that moment, in the evening, there might not be so much water there. Sometimes the tide is out. So you go through whatever the water is, and then you can go down and your feet sink into a little bit more into the more solid part, whatever that is, or they call it liquid mud in some places. And then you are okay, and you can be tovel in that mikveh. So similarly, inside the sukkah, if there's not too much of the schach posel, but it's not space, you're surrounded by good schach for the most part. And so therefore, it's like the mikveh that's for the most part the clearer water, and therefore you would be able to eat there. And that sounds like you could go almost either way on that. You just make sure that you can't have a lot of the shipudin or whatever the extra things you'd use for shade. You just can't have too much of it in one space. So I think it's very much comparable to the mikveh.
So the conclusion of Tosfos is that would you be allowed to dunk in this mud when it's joining a mikveh? The conclusion of Tosfos is no, and then it fits. Then you could fit the Gemara. In other words, tit hanorik, you're not allowed even when it's mixed with, even when it adds the measurement of the mikveh.
Right,
you still can't go in it, and then everything fits. The sukkah, right, it adds to the measurement of the sukkah, right, but you can't use the sukkah. The mikveh, it adds to the measurement of the mikveh, this pourable mud, but you can't dunk in it. That would be the then it sort of then it flows. Yeah. Okay, so that's the end of the Gemara that we did yesterday. We're up to the Mishnah.
I just wanted to say one other thing. When I was younger, people used to say, which are the mitzvahs you can do that require your entire body? I used to always make the comparison between a mikveh and a sukkah. Because,
right.
Okay, so I think that adds just a little bit, if that's the analogy. And I think that's why they're thinking more, let's say, philosophically about this.
Yes, it's an interesting connection. You're saying this, the Rabbi Yitzchok ben Elyashiv, that tit hanorok yechiach, that he compares a mikveh to a sukkah. There's a famous question on sukkah. Why do we call the holiday Sukkos and not lulav or esrog? And there are numerous reasons why sukkah is much more overpowering. And one of them is because it encompasses the whole body, while the lulav and the esrog, you're just shaking with your hand and maybe bring it to your heart, but it's not encompassing. Also, the sukkah, the whole sukkos starts from the beginning of the holiday. The lulav and esrog only starts by day. Yeah, so there's a number of reasons why Sukkah is much more. Sukkah applies all day. It's not just once a day. Lulav and Esrog is only once a day. So it starts at the beginning of the holiday. It's all day. It's at all times. It's all encompassing. So there's numerous reasons why Sukkah, but and then you have the concept of everything you do, even mundane activities, are meant to be done in the Sukkah, which means the Sukkah encompasses your entire material life, physical life, and spiritual life. You learn in the Sukkah, you daven in the Sukkah, you eat in the Sukkah, you hang out in the Sukkah, you play chess in the Sukkah. So the Sukkah is considered to be an all-encompassing mitzvah. All right. Anyway, so that's the thanks for that little insight, Jeffrey. Appreciate it. Yeah, that's a good point. It's very similar to mikvah. Okay, now we have the next Mishnah.
So the mikvah, I don't know if you're saying this, but the mikvah and the sukkah are both things that you enter totally. Your entire body is entered into it.
Yeah, that was Jeffrey's point, that your whole body is encompassed. Good point. Okay, we're up to the Mishnah on the second line, 19b. Yudtes Amud Beis, 19b. The Mishnah says, Ha'isa sukasai kemin tzrif. If a person makes his sukkah like a tzrif, it's some type of a teepee or a cone that they would use to catch birds. Rashi uses the word, it's similar to a beehive, kaveres, that basically its wall, its roof and its wall is one. What does that mean? It means that if you take like a cone shape or some type of roundish type of thing, and it all comes up to one little point in the top. So where does the walls end, and where does the roof begin? And so that's this case of a sukkasai kamin tzrif. You're making the sukkah like this type of hut of the hunters hut.
It says here circular hut.
Circular hut. Okay, thank you. But the word tzrif I don't think means circular, but that's the interpretation. It's a circular hut. Okay, and then it says Oisha Samcha L'Koisel, or you put it near a wall. What did you do? You leaned the schach that you're going to be using for schach and for your walls. What you did was, imagine just taking a lot of bamboo poles and just leaning them on a slant next to your house. So you want to sit under that area. What do you have? You have a wall and a roof of bamboo. You got these bamboo sticks. But where does the roof begin and where does the wall end? It's all interchangeable. And the Mishnah says, so you were samcha l'kaisel, you leaned it against the wall, and it's kosher for schach, it's kosher for the walls, of course. But the thing is, Rabbi Eliezer says it's possible, it doesn't have a roof. Now, Rashi uses that bamboo. Rashi uses the word kanim, reeds, but basically it's the same idea. And it doesn't have a roof. Rashi tells us it means it's not recognizable. What's the roof and what's the wall? And it's a tent that's meshupah, that's slanted. This is not called a tent. There needs to be a tefach zakuf. There has to be a handbreadth that would be straight. You can't have just the slanted thing. You need a straight handbreadth in order to be a roof. Here it's ein lagag. It's not recognizable what would what's the roof, what's the wall. If you had a handbreadth on top of flat, straight area from the end of these bamboo poles or the reeds, and you had a horizontal handbreadth that would separate between these bamboos or reeds and the wall, then that would be a oihel. That would be like the tent. That would be theoretically that there's a roof. It'll be considered anyway. So Rebbe Elazar says it's invalid. It's not recognizable. What's the roof? What's the walls? And the rabbis say it is kosher. And even if it's not recognizable, it could still be considered an oihel, and it's considered a sukkah, and it would be okay. Now, how big does those poles have to be? This is a big topic of discussion in the commentaries, because we understand that a sukkah needs to be 10 handbreadths tall and 7 handbreadths long. So when it comes to this type of I don't even know what we should call it, a slanted, what would you call it? They're just like a bamboo slanted sukkah, a bamboo poles that are against the wall. When you have that, so how much space do you need in order for this to be a kosher sukkah? So there are commentaries that want to say that as long as you have 17 handbreadths, it's good, because you could claim that 10 of the handbreadths are for the wall and 7 are for the schach, which would mean that it's 10 high and 7 across, even though it's all imaginable, because it's not exactly that measurement. It's all a slant. And but the question on that is, it's not exactly 10 handbreadths tall, because the first few, a lot of the area there is not, it never reached 10 handbreadths. It's starting on the floor, starting on the earth, and it's going up slowly, gradually climbing up and getting larger. The space is getting larger and larger. So it's not exactly what you would say 10 handbreadths tall. It's also not exactly the 7, when you reach the 10 handbreadths tall, it's not exactly 7 handbreadths from there. It's not exactly 7 handbreadths from there to the wall. Why do I say that? Because when it's on a slant, so let's say it reaches 10 handbreadths of length, if it reaches 10 handbreadths of length over here, but really in height, if you count from the ground, you're not going to get to 10 handbreadths over here. So now you're going to go and say, oh, well, there's 7 handbreadths of space. Well, not exactly, because from here to the from here to the wall, it's only 3 handbreadths left. So it seems surprising that we're going to be allowed to calculate it that way, but that's how some of the commentaries say that it has to be 17 handbreadths, and that would be good enough. So Taisa seems to say over here that it's talking about that after the area reaches 10 handbreadths, then you would be counting 7 handbreadths to the wall. And otherwise, you wouldn't be able to do it. You wouldn't be able to kosher it. Because you need 10 handbreadths tall and 7 handbreadths long. But then he says that maybe it would be good enough, because similar to psola yotzim in sukkah.
Yes, right.
So he says maybe if it has 4 handbreadths, that would be maybe that would be okay. And the Bach wants to switch what he says, that the question would be, the area, if some of it is less than 10 handbreadths, that's really what the question is. Some of it is less than 10 handbreadths. Is that really a problem? Because you're putting your feet there. Your feet doesn't necessarily need that height. So maybe that's where there's a little leeway, a little wiggle room over here with regard. In other words, at some point it needs to have 10 handbreadths, but how much of it needs to have 10 handbreadths? Anyway, so this is a topic of discussion that even the rabbis who permit this, what is the actual measurement that they're permitting? So Taisus himself seems to leave it a little vague, because in the end he seems to say maybe you could be lenient, psal hayotzim in sukkah, and so maybe it would be okay. Compares it to Rabbah and Rav Yosef's interpretation of psal hayotzim in sukkah, whatever. So there's room for discussion, and the commentaries, the Rishonim do talk about it. We're going to continue the Gemara. The Gemara says, Tana, it was taught in a brisa, Moide Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer admits, he agrees that she'im higbia min akarka tefach, if you lift up this type of sukkah that we talked about in the Mishnah, these two types of sukkahs, let's say you lift it up 1 handbreadth from the ground. So it starts a handbreadth above the ground. Or shehefliga min hakoisel tefach, or you the one that's slanted against the wall, you moved it away from the wall 1 handbreadth. So that sukkah, where my example was, if it's bamboo sticks that are slanted on top of a wall of your house, and you now, instead of having them leaning on the wall of your house in a slanted way, they're not touching the wall of your house. They're actually pushed away from the wall 1 handbreadth. Somehow you were able to have them put something there that blocked it. So there's 1 handbreadth of empty space between the slanted bamboo poles and the wall. So you were hefliga, you separated from the koisel, from the wall at tefach. Shehik sheira, even Rabbi Eliezer admits that it would be kosher. Why? Because that area of a tefach, that handbreadth, is not considered slanted, it's considered straight, and it would allow you to say this is a roof, this is a ceiling, this is a wall, and you would be able to then consider it a real type of tent and not just some type of a structure that's unclear what's a roof and this does have a definite roof, this does have a definite wall, it does have a wall, and the question is, so why would this work? Empty space? So the answer is, yeah, you have the law of Lavud, and the law of Lavud would allow, Rashi says this, that it's near the wall, but you separated it, and some type of pegs are holding it in that empty, holding it away from the wall, and we say lavud from there to the wall, and it's considered lavud a flat. It's considered like a straight lavud. It's not considered a slanted lavud, and that would be considered the roof, and it would be considered a kosher sukkah. Now this is of course very interesting, because what type of a schach do you have on this? You're calling this a roof? You're calling this a wall? The wall is empty. The roof is empty, right? What are you using exactly to be considered? Let's pick the case where you lifted it up a tefach, a handbreadth from the ground. So we're going to say lavud, that it's straight, a straight lavud. Now we say a straight lavud, that lavud attaches the two areas that are not connected. We're going to say a straight lavud, and there's a tefach, a handbreadth, and now we know that the whole cone is all a roof, and that handbreadth is a wall, right? That's what we're going to consider the wall, and it's considered a lavud wall. Now, it's considered an oil. It has a handbreadth. So it's considered an oil. It's considered a roof. You have that flat oil, or that flat roof of straight roof that's imaginary, called loved. So this is going to be considered kosher. The Gemara asks, "My time, what's the reason that the rabbis don't even need that? They hold that it's kosher as is." So the answer is shikue oyalim ka'oyalim dami, that a slanted tent is considered like a tent, that they hold that slant is not a problem. And you don't see the roof, no problem. You don't see the walls, no problem. Slanted is kosher, as that's considered a tent. They hold that a tent is a tent, even if it's slanted. So then the Gemara says, Abaye ashkechei Rav Yosef tkagoni b'chilas chasana. Abaye found Rav Yosef that he was resting or sleeping. He was lying in a bed that was called the kilas chasanim. It's a type of bed. It's almost like a teepee or whatever. It has basically on the top of the bed, there's a canopy that's slanted, maybe like the letter A. It's like it goes like the capital A. That it's that's how the bed that's the fancy, some type of fancy bed that they used to have, where you have this canopy around it, but it's not the one with 4 poles that it makes it like a square. Instead, it's like the letter A, so it comes to a point, and it's that's the type of kilas chasanim we're talking about. And he was sleeping in the sukkah, kilas chasanim, the sukkah. And so Amalei, he tells him, "Come on, who are you following? Whose opinion are you following?" So, in other words, according to the rabbis, is this called a tent? If it's a tent, then you have a tent inside a sukkah. That means that you're not in the sukkah. That means you're in the tent. If it's not a tent, no problem. You just have some type of cloth over you, but it's not a tent. But if you're in a tent, then you're not in the sukkah. You're in a tent under the sukkah. So you're not really in the sukkah. So the rabbis seem to hold that a slanted roof is considered a roof. It doesn't have to be flat on top for a handbreadth. So according to the rabbis, this is considered a tent under blocking the sukkah. That means that you're stuck in a tent and you're not considered inside the sukkah. So the Gemara says, so Abaye is very surprised that Rav Yosef is sitting in this type of sleeping in this type of a sukkah. So he says, who are you holding like Rabbi Eliezer? You're holding like Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer holds that this is not called an oil. It's not called a tent. Okay, if it's not called a tent, then you could sit such a thing in a sukkah. But if it is a tent, then the rabbis hold it is a tent. So how are you doing like you're holding like Rabbi Eliezer? So he says, Shavakta Rabbanan Vavadata Rabbi Eliezer. You left the rabbis and you're following Rabbi Eliezer. That's not the halacha. The halacha is you have to follow the rabbis, the majority. And the majority is that this is called a tent. Kilas chasanim is a tent. So Amar Lei, so Rav Yosef answered him back, no. Braisa ipchatani. The Braisa says the opposite, that it has an argument between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, and which is just like the Mishnah, except that in the Braisa, the opinions are the opposite, where the rabbis are the ones who prohibit this type of a sukkah if it's slanted. And if the rabbis are the ones that prohibit this type of sukkah, that means that the rabbis are the ones that hold this is not a tent. If it's not a tent, then you can sit inside a sukkah, inside this kilas chasanim. And what's the brisa? So it says, Rabbi Eliezer machshav v'chachamim paislim. The brisa says that according to this brisa, it's Rabbi Eliezer is machshir, and the rabbis possible. So if the rabbis make it invalid when you just have a sukkah that is doesn't have clarity on what's the roof, what's the schach, what's the walls, and the rabbis invalidate such a sukkah. And basically it boils down to the fact that the rabbis hold an oil that doesn't have a flat tefach is not called an oil, and which basically means you can't tell the difference between the roof and the walls. So if it doesn't have that, that's not called an oil. And the rabbis who say that would allow a kilas chasanim inside a sukkah because it's basically not called a tent. So he's following the Brisa's version of it. So Abaye says, "Oh, really? You want to follow the Brisa? Shavakta masnisin v'avada took a Brisa. You want to just leave the Mishnah and just do like the Brisa? That's not acceptable. You're supposed to follow the Mishnah, the way Rebbe taught the Mishnah. That's what the correct. That should be the correct version. So Amar le masnisin yechidahi. The Mishnah, the way our Mishnah says it, is really a individual's view. It's a das yachid. It's an individual view. It's yechidahi. Who is that? The Tanya, because we learned in a brisa, if you make the sukkah, if he makes the sukkah like a tzrif, this cone type of shape, this roundish beehive shape type of a sukkah, where there's no clear end for the wall and no clear beginning of the roof, or shesamcha l'koisel, or you put it leaning against the wall. So Reb Nosson Amar, Reb Nosson says that Rebbe Eliezer is the one who's koisel, ne'shein lagag. Rebbe Eliezer says it's invalid because it doesn't have a roof. But Chachamim machshirin, and the Chachamim, the rabbis, are the ones who permit it. That Brisa tells us that our Mishnah, who says this, these two views, is really only Reb Nosson's version of it. But really, the Brisa is the other version, and that's much more opinions. Remember that that's the correct. That the other version is more correct, and it's really the rabbis who prohibit such a sukkah, which means that it's not considered a tent, which means that you would be allowed to sit inside a kilas chasanim in your sukkah, and there would not be a problem of it being a tent inside a tent, because a kilas chasanim is not called a tent because it doesn't have a clear roof, because it doesn't have a full size handbreadth of flat roof. And now we're up to the next Mishnah.